Welcome to Fast Keto. I'm your host, Ketogenic Girl. Hey guys, welcome back to Fast Keto. I am so excited to have Dr. Paul Saladino joining us today. I first heard him on the Ben Greenfield podcast, and he is a carnivore doctor who is basically following a ketogenic diet, and we had a great time chatting today. He is super insightful and knowledgeable about nutrition, and being a biochemist and an MD, he has an incredible amount of knowledge on just overall health and the connection between functional medicine, health, and the nutrition and nutrients that we eat. And I learned so much from our conversation. I hope that you enjoy it and get a lot out of it. But stop over on Instagram and leave me a comment with any of the insights or takeaways that you had from today's show. If you haven't yet, go and check out my cookbook. It is my absolute labor of love, Keto Essentials, over on Amazon.com. And it is a comprehensive book all about keto, ketogenesis, and has all my favorite go-to keto recipes that I love to make. It is filled with delicious breakfasts, lunches, dinners, keto treats, and so many fun things and meals that I know that you'll enjoy. Go check out Keto Essentials on Amazon.com. And now, on to our show. Welcome to Fast Keto, Dr. Saladino. It is so great to have you here with us this morning. Thank you for joining us.
Of course, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
I cannot get past the irony of your last name. What took me? When I was actually looking at it, I'm like, no way. No, there's actually no way. But it actually, you are Dr. Salad.
I am Dr. Salad. One of my emails, which people should not use, is Paul Salad. You know, it's so funny. And I used to have an Instagram many years ago when I was in medical school, which was Paul Salad was my handle. That's not my handle anymore. It's Paul Saladino, MD. But yeah, I think that there's great irony, and many people have pointed this out to me on a variety of social media outlets, that one of the doctors, you know, at the center of carnivore movement has a last name with salad in it. So, well, I mean, I think it's pretty funny.
I live for irony. I think it's a spice of life. So when I saw that, I was like, that is amazing. So were you ever a vegetarian? Because that would be super fitting for you if you're a vegan or a vegetarian at any point.
I was. I definitely was. I mean, I think like many people in this space, I've been curious about diet for a long time. I mean, probably 13 to 14 years ago when I was working as a physician assistant. So I went to college and thought I was going to go to medical school. And my dad was a doctor. And at the end of college, I was pretty burned out. I studied chemistry and biology and worked really hard in college and had some great mentors, but just finished college with a lot of, you know, young adult curiosity about the world. And so I took a bunch of time off. It ended up being 6 years of time where I was just traveling the world and just gallivanting and vagabonding. I was in New Zealand for 8 months, skiing in the backcountry and hiking all over New Zealand. And then I came back to the US and hiked the Pacific Crest Trail and was a ski bum for a number of years and spent time in a lot of incredible mountain towns along the Mountain West. But after that, I went to PA school thinking, oh, my dad's a doctor. He kind of got, you know, killed by medicine, not literally, thankfully, but figuratively. I think his soul was pretty crushed by mainstream medicine for most of his life. So I thought that being a physician assistant would be a good compromise. But what I quickly discovered when I was a PA was that I wasn't doing enough for people. I was just kind of stuck in this medical model. I couldn't really affect as much change as I was hoping to because I couldn't change the paradigm. But it was during that time when I was working as a PA that I got interested in food and what were actually at the roots of disease. And I had a vegan experiment. I did a fully raw vegan diet, because if you're going to go vegan, why not go raw vegan? And it was about 7 months, and it was interesting. In retrospect, it was probably not at all the best thing for my body, and I lost a lot of weight. I was running semi-competitively at the time, and So for me, losing a lot of weight didn't seem like a bad thing, but in retrospect, I think I was pretty unhealthy, and I was bordering on, a very unhealthy weight. And if I look at the pictures of myself from that time period, I was just gaunt, and I wasn't doing any nutritional testing, but I fear that if I had done nutritional testing, it would have looked really bad. And I think that if I'd stayed with it any longer, things would have gotten really bad for me. But, I eventually discovered functional medicine and people talking about sort of these ancestral origins of where humans have come from. And as soon as I heard that, it just like a bell just rang in my mind. And I was like, well, that makes so much sense. Like, humans had eaten meat for our entire evolution, for the entire time that we've been humans, whether it's Homo sapiens in the last, 70, 80,000 years ago. I think some people imagine that Homo sapiens have been around for about 300,000 years ago. But, whether it's, Homo sapiens for the last 300,000 years, or Homo erectus or Homo habilis or Homo neanderthalensis, like, we've been eating meat. There's clear evidence that humans were primarily hunters, and it's just like, oh yeah, that's written in our genetics. We've evolved with meat. This is what we should be eating. Why am I doing this? And, but that was my vegan experiment. It didn't go well for me.
My husband has this amazing saying. He says the old word for vegetarian was bad hunter.
It's probably pretty true. I think that the old word for vegetarian was also starvation. Yeah. Like winter starvation, a time of the year when we couldn't get animals. Maybe plant foods were used as starvation food, but my strong opinion would be that plant foods are probably best used as starvation food. There's clear evidence that animal foods are optimal, but that's what we can get into in the podcast.
Yeah, and I thought you'd like that because I've heard you refer to plant foods as being kind of survival food. And it is an interesting way to look at it, for sure, that, if you weren't able to hunt or find meat, that, you could sustain yourself on that. But does that mean that should be our main diet? Is a big difference. And I love what you said about our evolution and our ancestral diets and how long we've been surviving on mostly meat. And then you look at our most recent ventures into, I was a vegetarian for 17 years. So
that's a long time.
Making up for a lot of protein deficiency with keto and keto carnivore. But it's really a parentheses in our history, a very small period of time that we veered off from that. And we're seeing the consequences of it now. So why do you think we've veered so far off that path? And why is it so crazy? Or do people think that this is this insane, restrictive, crazy diet?
Well, if you look at, I guess I'll just start by saying that I did an interview on my YouTube channel with a paleoanthropologist named Miki Ben-Dor. I'll refer people to that if they have questions about the anthropology. Oh. In that interview, we talked a lot about a series of studies that have come out over the last few years looking at the amount of nitrogen in collagen from tissues of Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens. And what they see in those tissues is that there are very high levels of nitrogen, which suggest that humans were what they would call high-level trophic carnivores. We were eating the majority of our diet as meat, quote unquote. I just want to clarify that we're not just talking about meat, muscle meat. I'm talking about eating animals nose to tail and eating all the parts of the animal. There's this colloquialism people think of, oh, they're eating just meat. No, they're not just eating meat. They're eating organs and liver. We'll talk about that for sure, the importance of eating nose to tail. But there's clear evidence from the fossil record that our ancestors were eating a large amount of meat. They were probably eating the majority of their diet as animals. And they're high-level trophic carnivores. You can compare the amount of nitrogen in the collagen of Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens to other carnivores living at the time, like hyenas. And we actually had more nitrogen. The idea with the nitrogen studies is that plants have some amount of nitrogen, animals have more. And so when you eat animals, and you eat bigger animals, you concentrate even more nitrogen in your bones. So it's a pretty good proxy for the amount of animal food that we were eating. And we have levels of nitrogen in our bones, or our ancestors had levels of nitrogen in their bones and collagenous tissues that were even higher than known carnivores like hyena, probably because we were eating bigger animals than hyena and also eating mostly animals. And so the question that you ask is a really good one. Where did we go wrong? Or where did we start thinking that that wasn't the way to do things? Mm-hmm. I think it's been within the last 50 years, honestly. And I think that it's tied to the advent of epidemiology, which has, in my opinion, confused the entire equation in a very sad and damaging way for, I would say, millions of people. I think that if you even went back 100 years ago, to 1919 or, 1890 or any of those things, those times, I think that people knew that meat and animal foods were by far the best foods, and they just couldn't always get them. That we weren't farming or ranching in the same ways we are now, and people had to eat plant foods as survival foods. Even as recently as 100 years ago, we couldn't get as many animals as we wanted. I mean, 200 years ago, we were still hunting. We had to go out, into the Wild West and shoot a buffalo. And if we couldn't do that, then we would have to eat plant foods. We couldn't always do those things. But I think even then our not so, distant ancestors knew that animal foods were clearly the best source of nutrients, whether it's amino acids, whether it's macronutrients, whether it's, protein and fat, or micronutrients, which we can get into as well, all the vitamins and minerals. But I think within the last 50 years, there's been a progression in the scientific community, and we've started doing things like epidemiology, which are not interventional studies, they're observational studies, and there are a variety of epidemiologic studies. There are cohort studies, which can be prospective or retrospective. There are case control studies, but these are observational studies where we look at a group of people over time and we do a survey and ask them what they've been eating throughout their life, and then we try and draw conclusions based on their health and what they've been eating. And I think that people will immediately notice when I say that that's kind of a flawed that's kind of a flawed way to do things. That can't be that accurate. We certainly can't. We can't clearly know any causative connection between what people have been eating and how their life turns out. We can perhaps suggest some correlative information, but the problem is that we are basing the majority of our nutritional information in this country right now on epidemiologic studies, and all of the interventional studies with vegetables, with meat. I mean, there really have not been many interventional studies with meat, but there have been some interventional studies with vegetables, which we can talk about. They have been telling us a completely different story than the epidemiology. So the epidemiology is leading us astray. And so what I'm referring to here are a number of studies which suggest, from an epidemiologic perspective, that people who eat more fruits and vegetables are healthier. They have better cardiovascular outcomes. They might live a little longer. The problem with this is that we don't know whether it was eating the fruits and vegetables that did that, or whether it was other healthy behaviors that people did who were eating those fruits and vegetables that resulted in those benefits. And I think that we get some insight into the answer to this question if we look across other cultures. Most of the epidemiology that we're drawing from, or that the guidelines or that the popular opinions are based on, are done in the westernized countries, which have been told for the last 50 to 60 years that eating vegetables are good for you. So there's this not so subtle propaganda. We've been told eating vegetables are good for you, eating meat and animal products is bad for you. So people who ate more vegetables were doing the healthy thing. They were doing the healthy thing, quote unquote, at the time, and they were doing other healthy behaviors too. People that have been eating more fruits and vegetables for the last 50 to 60 years have also been doing other healthy behaviors, getting out in the sun more, exercising, that are of a higher socioeconomic status. They follow their doctor's other recommendations, like getting regular checkups, getting breast exams, getting colonoscopies, these sorts of things. And these, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many people who are highly critical of epidemiology, these are the behaviors that are giving them higher levels of health, not the ingestion of fruit and vegetables. And the reason we can say that with such strong opinion is that when we actually look at fruit and vegetable intervention trials, when they compare groups of people and they look at markers like cardiovascular markers, lipid markers, markers of DNA damage, markers of oxidative stress. And they've done these studies, and it's crazy that no one knows about them. They've done studies where they have groups of people who eat no vegetables and groups of people who eat more than a pound of vegetables a day, and they've looked at them for a month or 10 weeks. There are a variety of studies we can talk about, and I can quote specifically, but what they find invariably in these vegetable intervention studies is that there's no difference in the people who are eating 0 vegetables per day, 0 fruits and vegetables per day, and the people who are eating 1.5 pounds of vegetables per day in terms of oxidative stress, DNA damage, other markers of clinical and cardiovascular health, other markers of immunologic health. It's just this mind-blowing concept. Wait a minute, vegetables don't do anything for humans? Well, no. If you look at the intervention trials, they don't do anything. But we've just been sold this bill of goods that's just false based on confounded epidemiology with this healthy user bias. It's just it's kind of an insidious story. And if you really dig into it, which we don't have to do now, it's probably based on political agendas and the fact that there are a lot of political agendas around vegetarian-based ideology and the Seventh-day Adventists and other things like this that probably got snuck into the political bodies and the governing bodies who are making the guidelines, and it's really been a misleading path for us over the last 50 years, and we're trying to reverse it, but man, old ideas die hard.
All right, guys, I know that you care just as much as I do about feeding your families the most nutrient-dense, high-quality food and meats, and also being able to save money and be on a budget. That's why I love ButcherBox. It saves you time and it saves you money by not having to go to the store and shop. And you also get incredible deals. They have a brand new promotion that is running in March, and it is for anyone who signs up that is a fan of Fast Keto. You can go to butcherbox.com/Fast Keto, and if you sign up, you will get free ground beef for life, plus $20 off for signing up using my link, and that's butcherbox.com/Fast Keto. You get free ground beef for life. That's 2 pounds of free ground beef in every monthly ButcherBox order that you get for the life of your membership. Now, this is a great way to save money, save time, and be able to feed your family nutrient-dense food. So check out the link. I'll put it in the show notes as well. It's butcherbox.com/Fast Keto. Yeah, I read that studies get read an average of 7 times. Published studies.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I just love that there's so much dialogue out there happening in our community, especially with people talking about studies and highlighting them and, explaining the research in ways that are easy for people to understand. And so that, we can look at these studies more and talk about them. Like you said, there's all this amazing research out there, and yet we're still going on these old ideas, that have been put forth by food guidelines and various interests that may not necessarily be serving our own. It's cool to be part of this movement, moving this forward and, like you said, disrupting things. I always love bringing up the topic of fruit because I'm guaranteed to get hate messages and a lot of violent responses whenever I bring up fruit. But what brought you here to where you are now? How did you first get into keto? I think of carnivore as a ketogenic diet because ketogenesis is brought on by a low carbohydrate diet, which carnivore you are by default. If you're fasting or doing carnivore, you're at 0 carb pretty much, except for base carbs. So how did you get into this keto space and then to carnivore personally for yourself?
Yeah, I can tell you that story. Do you want to talk about fruit? I mean, I think that if we're going to get hate messages, we should talk about fruit. I mean,
well, luckily this is a safe space, and most people listening are like somewhat open to the idea that fructose may not be the best thing for your body, but I have covered that on a lot of podcasts. I'd love to talk about your story and like what brought you to where you are today. And, for a physician, I've interviewed I think you're maybe the 5th or 6th doctor that I've had on the show that is carnivore, doing it for themselves. And to me, that gives me a lot of confidence in following keto carnivore for myself because I know, well, if you're a physician, obviously you've looked into it. I love that you're testing it out on yourself. So I'd love to know how you got here and what brought you here.
Yeah, so I mean, it kind of goes back to the vegan days. I was doing the vegan thing 13 or 14 years ago and then transitioned out of that when I thought about these sort of ancestral themes and basically went to a paleo diet at the time and was pretty strictly paleo. I mean, when I do something with diet, I don't mess around. I love the experimentation and I want to understand how it works. So I was pretty strictly paleo, almost entirely organic paleo for, probably a decade after that. Throughout medical school, I ended up returning to medical school after I was a PA because I realized that I wanted to get full autonomy and I wanted to finish my training or go back to get a doctorate degree to get my MD and then do the functional medicine thing. But throughout that time, I was doing a lot of paleo dieting, and I'd experimented with ketogenic diets, but most of what I was doing was kind of moderate carbohydrate paleo. I think, people would probably consider it low carb, high fat in some sense, depending where you draw the line for low carb. And I felt pretty good doing that. I think I definitely had things pop up here and there. One of the things I've talked about on other podcasts was that I've had eczema throughout my adult life, which was never terribly severe, except for a few instances when I was in medical school. But I've definitely had some eczema. And, I had instances in medical school when I was doing a lot of jujitsu and perhaps connected with dairy. For me personally, I had triggering of my eczema, or other things that I've noticed triggered my eczema throughout the years. And I had pretty bad eczema, which eventually led to like impetigo and some of the eczema getting super infected. So, I always had this thing in my mind, like I haven't solved my autoimmune issues. I'm doing paleo. I think I'm doing all the right things, and I just haven't fully solved it. Something is not right here. And I would do labs on myself occasionally in medical school, and they would bounce around. I would even see, CRPs or, inflammatory markers that were not totally ideal when I was on paleo. At sometimes I had HSCRP that was above 1, and I was always kind of questioning what's going on here. Why isn't this looking a little better? And so when I was in medical school, I heard a talk by Georgia Ede from the Ancestral Health Symposium in 2012. And she's a psychiatrist on the East Coast and had kind of noticed that some of these plant foods were actually triggering people in her practice. And I thought, well, isn't that an interesting concept? I'm thinking that paleo is an ancestral way of eating, but actually plants really don't want to get eaten in the first place. And maybe I should be eating less of these plants. And that kind of was in my mind for a little bit. And I experimented with like precursor versions of the carnivore diet and then kind of like went back to doing paleo and never really got a whole lot of clarity in that space. And then, for me, I've really come to the ketogenic and carnivore movement in the last year. And it was pretty much based on this eczema, which continued to kind of nag me. And last summer or, last spring, I had quite a bit of eczema, or 2 years ago, I had quite a bit of eczema. And I was thinking, what is going on? Like, I am eating this diet that I think is just pristine. And believe me, I think a lot about my diet. So I would just try and do the best source foods. And eczema would not go away. And what I thought was, maybe it's the plants. I think I heard Sean Baker on Joe Rogan, and I heard Jordan Peterson talk about his autoimmune issues and his daughter Michaela's autoimmune issues that resolved when they cut out plants. And it just kind of triggered this light bulb again for me. And I remembered these talks from Georgia Ede, and I remembered the things I thought about in medical school, like, that's right, plants really don't want to get eaten. Maybe we don't need any plants in our diet. That's kind of a radical concept, but let's look into it. And that was when I kind of like came into the carnivore space and really dove in. And of course, as a physician and a self-experimenter, I wanted to know, what are all the vitamins and minerals that a human needs? Can I really get all these in meat? Are there going to be problems eating all this meat? Is my body going to be able to handle all this protein? Is my body going to get everything it needs? What about vitamin C? Do I need fiber? What about these polyphenols? Are they beneficial? Am I hurting myself by not having plant polyphenols? And that's been my sort of deep dive journey over the last year. And it's been fascinating, and happy to dive into all that.
It's funny because when I saw in your bio that you were doing a residency in psychiatry, I was like, I bet Georgia Ede was some kind of influence at some point. And you must love reading her amazing website and, the work that she's done. I'm curious what your thoughts are on her work and sort of the effects of the anti-nutrients in plants on the brain and mood.
Oh, I mean, it's huge. I'm at the end of my residency in psychiatry. I'll be done in a couple of months. So it's been a long road. Psychiatry residency is 4 years after 4 years of medical school. But, I would think, I think of mood, anxiety, and psychiatric disease as autoimmune in the majority of cases. And that means that the body's reacting against itself. And there's tons of evidence for this now. If we really look at the literature, psychiatric, neurology literature, we see activation of the immune system in the brain. And so I think that these are the themes that George has been talking about, and the themes that need to be more understood in psychiatry, that depression and anxiety, OCD, even psychotic disorders, bipolar, for many people with these disorders, there is inflammation in the brain. This is the brain on fire. This is activation of the microglial cells in the brain, which are brain-derived macrophages. We see a transition from the M1 to the M2 phenotype of these cells in the brain. There's clearly autoimmunity and inflammation happening in the brain, which begs the question, what is causing this? That is the most important question that we're always asking from a functional medicine perspective. I would argue that that is what defines functional medicine, is our preponderance to ask that question, what is causing this issue? What is the root cause? And that leads me to all sorts of interesting hypotheses about plants and whether it's anti-nutrients in plants or lectins or the plant pesticides that are made by the plant. All of these could be potential triggers of the immune system, in addition to other plant anti-nutrients triggering the immune system, probably originally in the gut and leading to autoimmunity. I think that that's the overarching sort of 15,000-foot view of the hypothesis, is that for many people with autoimmunity, these anti-nutrients in plants, these plant pesticides, and these plant lectins could be triggering the immune system. The majority of the immune system surrounds the gut in a layer of tissue called the lamina propria, directly below the gastrointestinal epithelium. And that is really ground zero. That is where our immune system comes into contact with all of these foods, kilogram quantities of molecules that are signaling molecules in the food that we eat every day. And as I talked about before, and as we can dive into if you want, signals that are coming from plants are not always friendly. They're often quite angry and unfriendly and damaging to humans. And I think that for many people is at the root of their autoimmunity. And I think that's the root of autoimmunity in general, is molecular signaling beginning in the gut that is triggering the immune system. And that can be a variety of things. It can be food, it can be supplements. I think for a lot of people, there are binders and issues with supplements that can trigger autoimmunity. All sorts of things can come into the gut that can trigger an autoimmune reaction to people. But that's sort of ground zero. And I think it absolutely is connected with psychiatric illness. And many people, I think, are sort of stuck in this old perspective, even within the psychiatric community. They're stuck in this old perspective of the monoamine hypothesis and the idea that that it's not enough serotonin, which is just an absurd concept behind depression. It's much more complicated than that. We may see in some people lower levels of serotonin in the synapse, but that's not the cause of depression, because we sometimes see people who have low serotonin in the synapse and they're not depressed, and that's an overly simplistic hypothesis. A neurotransmitter hypothesis for depression or anxiety or any of these things is overly simplistic. And I think that once we expand the view and imagine it as an immunologic issue, we start to really conceptualize it a little more accurately. And that begs, much bigger questions about what is activating the immune system like this.
I love that you brought up serotonin, because I'm wearing my serotonin molecule necklace today. I just happen to be wearing it. That's funny. But I really like the connections that you drew there, because I was going to ask you if you follow the work being done at Paleo Medicina, which is not too far from me in Hungary, in Budapest here. And I know Michaela was recently visiting with them, because they really have a framework that they're operating from, that there is this connection between mood, depression, psychological issues, and the gut lining, and how permeable the gut is. They're working on some connections between that and eating a more meat-based diet and reducing some plant foods, and I'm really fascinated by that, and that it might be more having to do with the gut actual lining and condition, but then I really like the connections you're making there as well about triggering that immunity, or that immune response in the body. Hey guys, so I want to tell you about a brand new company that I just found out about called EMeals. What they do is offer a service that makes it a little bit easier to follow any kind of lifestyle. They've been doing it with Paleo for a while and with other kinds of diet and lifestyle, and they just launched a brand new one for keto. So what they do is they have a keto plan which includes dietitian-approved meals and targets the right macros for you. And the meals are easy to make and taste amazing. What happens is each week you get 7 dinners, 1 breakfast, 1 lunch, and 1 dessert. and that connects directly to a smart shopping list with online grocery pickup and delivery options. And that saves you time and money. So the meal plan directly connects to the shopping list, and you can go through this app that they have and pick out meals that you like, recipes you like, kind of customize and build your meal for the week, and it will take that, send it to your local grocery that does deliveries, and the groceries will show up at your door, and then you have the recipes in the app that you can make meals from during the week. So I think they offer a really great service. It really enables you to save time and money because of being directly connected to your local grocery store with this smart shopping list. It's a subscription-based app, and you also get access to other bonus collections of keto recipes from different keto authors and other influencers in the space that specialize in the keto space. 4-week keto is all you really need to maintain a ketogenic diet on their easy-to-use platform. So go to emeals.com/keto today, and you'll get a 14-day trial if you want to test them out. That's emeals.com/keto, and check them out. Let me know if you like the service, what you think of it. If it's something that you found helpful for you, I would love to know. So be sure to go check them out. I definitely recommend this as a fantastic app and service.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with their work. I think they're doing great stuff, and I pretty much agree with them on most of the things that they're suggesting. You know, they have a pretty high fat to protein macro that I don't think everybody needs to do, but I would agree. I think that they're on the right track, and I've seen their work, and I would mirror much of that. I think that absolutely that this probably boils down to this colloquial concept of leaky gut, which is something that we're trying to define from a medical perspective, and I don't think it's very easily defined. But yeah, I think that the work of Alessio Fasano at Harvard, looking at zonulin levels, suggests that there's a connection here. And I mean, leaky gut is an actual real phenomenon. If you talk to any critical care docs, you know, patients in the ICU do get sepsis. They get leaky gut. They get, you know, gastrointestinal hyperpermeability. And it's probably something along the spectrum like you might see with wheat or gluten sensitivity. You know, we know that people are celiac and they actually have regression of the microvilla and the small intestine with celiac, and you can see antibodies. But even people who don't have the antibodies or don't have elevated tissue transglutaminase levels or don't have biopsy-proven celiac disease seem to have sensitivity to wheat. And I would argue that's probably something similar to leaky gut. I mean, in the ICU, in the critical care unit, you're going to see people with really, really bad permeability to their intestine, and that can cause major issues. But I think every day in our lives, you know, what I see in my private practice and with my clients is that I think the majority of people eating a lot of plants or eating a lot of these plant toxins from a variety of sources, even things like coffee and tea, can probably induce some gastrointestinal hyperpermeability, can probably induce some leaky gut, can probably induce some irritation of the gut lining. And it's you know, it's variable. It's going to come and go, and you can repair it, and probably it gets worse postprandially, and then it could improve in a fasting state. But I think this is the ground zero. You know, we really need to keep this barrier between the gut lining and the immune system tight. And there are lots of studies that have been done in cell culture. It's kind of hard to study in vivo, but in cell culture, we can do transepithelial electrical resistance and look at changes in transepithelial electrical resistance, or TEER, in response to food. And there have been studies of food spices and other foods, and even compounds like glyphosate, which is Roundup, have been studied in cell culture, and they've been shown to change or decrease the TEER, suggesting that they are creating some sort of permeability in the gut. And if you look at, there's other studies of actual spices, and especially all the pepper spices, like the capsaicin spices, the chilies.
Nightshade.
Yeah, the nightshades. So the solanaceae vegetables and the nightshade spices have been shown to change the TEER in cell culture, suggesting that, yeah, these, I mean, there's clear evidence that plants are causing leaky gut. And even things like black pepper can change it. And I talked about that on other podcasts. Piperine is one of the compounds in black pepper. So, yeah, we know that, at least in cell culture, plants can disrupt the epithelial lining, the integrity of the gut lining, and change this transepithelial electrical resistance. It's a scary concept.
It is, and I think that's a great point to bring up is the Roundup. And, a lot of people don't realize that although Roundup has been banned, in North America, it's not banned necessarily in other countries where the food is imported from. And so even if someone may not be sensitive to any of the anti-nutrients in plants, they could be having reactions, and especially autoimmune reactions to, Roundup. And some of these chemicals and pesticides are so deadly. And I mean, how many of us actually take the time to soak our vegetables and things in, these products that, remove the pesticides? Like, we have busy lives, like we don't have time to soak everything for 15 minutes and, remove pesticides. It's just a great point that, it may not always be what's in the plants as well. You have to factor in what's put on them, or how they might be modified, and how the body, we talk about the importance of healthy DNA replication and how that could be interfering and causing mutagens potentially in the body.
Yeah, my impression is that Roundup is not illegal in the US. It's quite legal. I walked into Home Depot the other day and there was no less than 500, gallons of Roundup on a shelf. I mean, there's Roundup is everywhere. It's not illegal here. It's still sprayed on crops.
In the US, but not in Mexico. So, and then a lot of the, plants are being imported from Mexico. So
yeah,
that's crazy.
People can get it in the store here. People are spraying it on their lawns. It's water soluble. It's everywhere. It's on our produce. I mean, if it's non-organic produce, and even if it's organic produce, it's probably contaminated with Roundup because it's everywhere. It's between all the fields. It's water soluble. It's in the water table now. If people are not drinking, highly purified water, they're getting exposed to glyphosate. And a pesticide that's being used now is called Duo, which is Roundup and one of the components of DDT. So there's a lot of bad stuff out there, but those are just the exogenous pesticides that are sprayed on plants. I also highlight for people the fact that plants have endogenous pesticides. There's a fantastic paper, which is quite eye-opening, by Bruce Ames from 1999, and the title of the paper is Dietary Pesticides, 99.99% All Natural. And what he highlights in that paper is that plants are making thousands and thousands of pesticides in the plant to discourage animals from eating them. And so, in terms of relative harm, it's hard to say. I certainly don't think glyphosate is a useful molecule, and I think it's very damaging. But we are getting, 1,000 times more pesticides from plants themselves than we are getting glyphosate. He estimates that we eat 1.6 grams of plant pesticides per day. These are endogenous pesticides produced by the plants. These are endogenous plant defense molecules. And of course, we're getting, we're not even getting, we're getting microgram quantities of glyphosate if we're eating plants and things like that. So I'm not downplaying the importance of avoiding glyphosate. I'm just also similarly highlighting the fact that plants are producing their own pesticides. And many of these pesticides that plants produce are molecules that people imagine to be helpful for them, molecules that have been sold to people as helpful molecules. And I would argue strongly that this is a very misinterpreted view of the equation, and it's very harmful for people. I mean, these are molecules like sulforaphane. These are isothiocyanate molecules. These are plant defense molecules. These are not beneficial molecules to humans.
Yeah, I love how Dr. Eid puts it that, plants can't run away from their predators, so they have to have their own kind of defense mechanisms, and they develop a lot of, like you said, exogenous, compounds that, in order to protect themselves from us.
Yeah, the endogenous compounds in the plants. Yeah, they make their own compounds and they can't run away. And that's the evolutionary equation, is that an animal can run away from its predator, but a plant is stuck there. And so herbivorous animals have kind of co-evolved with plants, and they have learned that they can only eat so much of this plant and then so much of this plant and so much of this plant. If they eat too much of one plant, they'll get sick. And herbivorous animals have had a natural selection in their biochemistry to be able to detoxify many of these plant toxins. But humans branched off, and we've been hunting for the last 300,000, 500,000 years. We have not had selective pressures to detoxify these plant toxins, and they're pretty harmful for us. We have a system, we have the NRF2 pathway. We have an ability to detoxify them to some small extent, but I would argue that we detoxify them and they cause damage, even in small amounts. I mean, we can dive into sulforaphane if you want. It's kind of an interesting illustrative example. Sulforaphane is a molecule that is not a polyphenol per se in terms of organic chemistry, but it is very oxidatively reactive, meaning that in the body it acts as an oxidant. Sulforaphane causes free radicals in the human body. Sulforaphane causes oxidative stress. And sulforaphane is so oxidatively reactive that it's not even a molecule that exists in broccoli. The precursor molecule exists in broccoli and brassicate plants, and the precursor molecule is glucoraphanin. And it's used as a defense mechanism. The only way that sulforaphane gets produced is when we chew a brassicate vegetable, when we chew broccoli or kale or cauliflower. And this enzyme myrosinase combines with glucoraphanin to make sulforaphane. If a broccoli plant, if a kale plant had sulforaphane in it, if it had the molecule of sulforaphane in it, it would kill the plant. It would cause too much oxidative stress. So we see this pattern in plants, that plants have precursor molecules that when they combine with an enzyme in a different part of the cell, right, that only through chewing, it makes this toxic molecule. You see the same thing with cassava, which is a root used throughout South America that's frankly toxic. And there's a compound called linamarin, which is acted on by an enzyme called linamarinase to form hydrocyanic acid, which is a cyanogenic glycoside. And so cassava is frankly toxic if you just eat it, but it's used throughout South America through this extremely arduous process of, preparation. They have to do so many things to detoxify it. And the same thing is true with broccoli and all these brassicate vegetables. We have to really detoxify that in so many ways. And if you look at indigenous cultures, they've fermented these plants, and the fermentation will get rid of some of the isothiocyanates. But at that point, basically what you're creating is just a mush. Like, there's no benefit to that. They're using it, at that point, they're using it for macronutrients. They're not using it for micronutrients. So there's a little bit of nuance in there. But, we know that indigenous cultures figured this out. They realized, hey, if we have to eat plants because we can't get enough animals, these plants are toxic and we have to detoxify them. So they did a lot of fermentation of these plants to detoxify them. Now, that is going to reduce some of the toxins, but ultimately they're really not getting a whole lot of micronutrients. They're just getting macronutrients from those plants. So that's this interesting other kind of side idea that plants can be used for macronutrients just for survival, but in terms of micronutrients, that's animals. Animals are the micronutrient source. But the sulforaphane, the linamarin, the hydrocyanic acid, these are plant toxins. And the idea that sulforaphane is good for us comes from this misunderstanding that it's a hormetic compound. And so when we eat sulforaphane, it will activate our NRF2 pathway and induce a little bit of glutathione to be produced in the human body, which is a good thing. But what people are not told is that it will also circulate in the human body for a short amount of time and compete with iodine at the level of the thyroid, creating hypothyroidism. So all these people crushing broccoli sprouts, really, really are at risk for a hypothyroid condition. So this is a concept that I've talked about in other podcasts, that plants and animals are from different operating systems. We don't use plant molecules in our biochemistry. They are foreign molecules. And if people in the supplement industry, people who don't understand this, will try to point to one benefit to the plant molecule, often from a hormetic perspective. But if you look at the sum of the equation, you can always find other places in the human body where these foreign plant molecules are causing damage to the human body. And I would argue the hormetic benefit of plants is not unique to plants. We don't need plants to achieve optimal antioxidant status. We can do that through living a radical life. We can just do that through cold exposure, heat exposure, sun, exercise. Those are more than adequate to create plenty of glutathione for our bodies. So it's just this really misconstrued idea.
I love that you're speaking up so much about, the non-essentialism of carbohydrates and plant foods. I did a major rant, a rebuttal to Jillian Harris when she came out with her sort of indictments against keto back in the new year, and just explaining how, carbohydrates are non-essential, but yet we are so focused on getting them into our diet, and yet all the essentials really come from, protein and those essential amino acids and fatty acids. And, it's crazy, that broccoli sprouts could be so harmful potentially to people. And so many people come to keto actually because they have hypothyroid issues. So, thank you for sharing that information so people can, maybe take a second look if they're eating a lot of those sprouts, or, it's not about, I think, demonizing plants so much as just like, well, look at what you're eating. If you have unresolved health issues, maybe there's something that you're not looking at because you've been told that it's the healthiest thing that you're eating. And so you're never going to really look at the plants that you're eating, and you're never going to examine that or try to remove them or do anything because you think they're such a net benefit. You never think that there's any kind of net negative to them. So yeah, I love that you're talking about that, as especially as an MD, it carries a lot of weight for people.
Yeah, I think that some people tolerate plants better than others, and if someone is on a ketogenic diet or even a paleo diet and they're thriving and they're eating some plants and they're aware of where the plant anti-nutrients might be and they're not eating a ton of broccoli sprouts, then yeah, keep thriving. But if people are having issues, if they're having autoimmune issues or they're having fatigue or they're having brain fog or they're having dermatologic or psychiatric issues and they're trying a paleo or ketogenic diet, I would applaud them for making these intentional choices and then suggest, like you're saying, that sometimes for a lot of people, a lot of the plants are going to trigger that autoimmunity, and that you might want to think about even eliminating the plants for a while to see if you feel better. And that's sort of this transition to carnivore, that for some people, carnivore might be a better version of ketogenic diet that is free of these autoimmune triggers and these issues. But I do think that humans are facultative carnivores, meaning that we can tolerate some plants, but from my perspective, they're more of a survival food. But I also accept that most people want to eat plants at some point in their life for social reasons or to just have some color on their plate. That's fine. Just understand where it fits in the hierarchy of overall optimal health and sources of nutrients. You mentioned that animal foods are the best sources of nutrients, and I would echo that. I really see that animal foods are the best source of all of the nutrients that a human needs to function optimally in the most bioavailable forms in the appropriate ratios that a human needs without any of the anti-nutrients found in plants.
Let's talk about your nose to tail philosophy. I want to talk about that more because I've had a lot of carnivores on the show, and there's kind of a spectrum of where people fall on that philosophy. And I love your message about nose to tail. Is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on Fast Keto to talk about it more and talk about the importance of it, and getting past kind of our preconceived notions about the palatability of certain parts of the animal. When you perceive the nutrient density or what you might be getting from eating other parts of the animal and not just the muscle meat, there could be such a benefit to that. So I love for you to share.
Yeah, I think it goes back to these ancestral ideas that, I don't know if your listeners have hunted before or if you've hunted, but when we are connected with the animals that we are harvesting for food, it's a really spiritual type of thing. I hunted with a bow for a season when I lived in Flagstaff, Arizona. And, when I killed an animal with my bow and saw the animal there was an immediate spiritual sort of realization that I had just been given a gift, and that, we know that we are eating animals when we are eating a steak from the grocery store, but we're kind of divorced from the responsibility that comes with, and the idea that, wow, that's an animal that either willingly or unwillingly gave up its life for a human. And so there's this idea that in order for something to live, something else must die. And that's okay. That's the circle of life, that's just how it works. But I think that implicit in that we miss when we are not connected with the animals that we are eating is that there comes with it a responsibility to act as a good human. And that was immediately what I felt when I harvested that animal. I was like, wow, that's a beautiful animal. That's going to feed me and my friends, and so I had better be a good person. And so the other piece of that equation is you are going to eat every piece of that animal. You're not going to waste it, and you realize that as a human in that position, both for the respect of the animal and for your nutrients, there are unique nutrients in various parts of that animal, and you are going to eat everything in that animal. You're not just going to eat the tenderloin or the ribeye, of the deer or the cow. That doesn't make any sense. And if you look at the animal and you look at human nutrition, there are unique nutrients in every compartment of that animal. But, and I've said this before in other podcasts, if you could design the ultimate multivitamin for a human, it would be an animal. It would be an animal. That is your multivitamin, but you have to eat the entire animal. And so we can look at it, in a little more granular fashion. The muscle meat is great. The muscle meat has all the amino acids you need and some of the B vitamins, but only about half of the B vitamins are present in any appreciable quantity in the muscle meat. And it has some zinc. It has a lot of zinc, but it doesn't have a whole lot of copper. But if you look other places in the animal, you see this elegant symmetry that if you eat the liver, which is one of the more nutrient dense, probably the most nutrient dense part of the animal, you're going to get the rest of the B vitamins. So muscle meat is high in things like B6 and B12, and it's pretty decently high in riboflavin, but the liver is even higher in riboflavin, and the liver is a great source of folate and biotin, which are not really present at all in the muscle meat in terms of the B vitamins. And so we need the liver to complement the nutrition from the muscle meat. Similarly, with zinc and copper, there's a lot of zinc in muscle meat, but there's not a lot of copper. And if you eat too much zinc without balancing with copper, you can get a copper deficiency, which is a really big deal. So just from a nutritional standpoint, we have to eat muscle meat and organ meat together. We need to. We need the copper. We have to do this. We have to eat from all parts of the animal. So you can eat the muscle meat, you can eat the organ meat, and then there are other parts of the animal we should be eating too, like connective tissue. This goes back to this idea of methionine, glycine balance, and the idea that muscle meat is very rich in methionine. And there is some glycine in muscle meat, but there's so much methionine in muscle meat that we use up glycine to buffer that methionine. So we should be eating more of the glycine-rich tissues, which are the connective tissues, which are themselves made of collagen. And collagen is 3 amino acids, glycine, proline, and hydroxyproline. But muscle meat is about 7% glycine, and connective tissue is about 23% glycine. Muscle meat is about 2% methionine, and connective tissue is about 0.9% methionine. So we need to balance those ratios out to get our human biochemistry to work well. Then you can think about fat to protein macros and go back to the stories of the Arctic explorers who only ate small, lean animals, and you can get what's called rabbit starvation. We know that we can't just eat protein. We have to balance it with some fat, and those fat to protein macros are important to consider. And the fat sources of an animal have some fat-soluble vitamins. Our ancestors probably would have eaten the brain and the bone marrow, and bone marrow is probably a little more palatable than the brain, but if you look at the brain and bone marrow, those are good sources of things like omega-3 fatty acids, which we know we need. We can't make omega-3s. We need either EPA or DHA. We don't necessarily need alpha-linolenic acid, but we need EPA or DHA. We can't make those from scratch, and we know that humans are going to have that need for that. So we have to eat brain or bone marrow or some source of omega-3. We also need iodine, and where are you going to get iodine in an animal? Well, you can get it from if you eat the animal's thyroid, or if you eat some seafood or salmon eggs, things like this. So we're talking about eating all of the animal and eating probably across different even animal groups, getting some seafood, getting some eggs for the yolks, which have a lot of these other nutrients in them as well. And then, the last thing we have to think about is the bones and the fact that humans need calcium. We need calcium. We need minerals that are primarily found in bones. And this is where you can get like bone meal. A lot of people eat bone broth, but if you look at the nutritional composition of bone broth, a lot of the minerals don't go into the broth. So we probably need a calcium source. We know this. And I'm not a big fan of dairy. I think that dairy is very triggering for people immunologically. And so I really advocate for people eating bone meal or eggshells. We need a calcium source, and we need the minerals that are stored in the bones, specifically boron, manganese, vanadium, strontium. These are valuable for us, and they're only in the bone. And so this is what our ancestors do. If we look at indigenous cultures, they eat the soft ends of bones. They might grind the bone up into a little bit of meal and eat some of it. We don't need to eat a ton of bones, but we're always going to eat the bones. And a lot of the Eskimo and Inuit cultures would grind up fish with bones in it. People might do this when they're eating sardines, but that's just the idea that if we just look at human nutrition and you look at all the things a human needs, you have to eat throughout the animal to get those. And then it kind of works very well. I have, some concern about people on carnivore diets just eating meat. It's like, well, that's not enough. You're not going to do well. You need all the nutrients in the other parts of the animal. It's both respectful to the animal, it makes sense from an ethical standpoint, and nutritionally, that is clearly the way to get all the things we need and really to thrive.
For someone who isn't necessarily inclined to eat brain, would you recommend wild salmon? And maybe you could talk a little bit about the salmon roe.
Yeah, there are lots of ways to get omega-3. Bone marrow is a decent source, but I think that wild-caught fish that's low in mercury is a decent source. One of the things that I really like that I talk about a lot is salmon roe, which are salmon eggs. People often message me and ask about roe or eggs from other animals, and I think they're all great. But fish eggs are one of the things that have been prized by indigenous cultures throughout human history, and for good reason. They're an incredibly rich source of DHA in a phospholipid form, and there are various forms of DHA, triglyceride, ethyl ester, and phospholipid, but biologically occurring phospholipid forms of DHA have been shown to cross the blood-brain barrier more efficiently than triglyceride and ethyl ester forms of DHA and EPA, suggesting that we absorb them more avidly. So people can think of salmon roe and phospholipid forms of DHA as more concentrated forms of the omega-3, which will lead to more efficient storage in the brain and other omega-3 rich tissues. So I really like salmon roe. This kind of gets to this really sad issue that we have polluted the earth and that a lot of fish is quite high in mercury. So I would just caution people to be aware of their heavy metal contamination. But there are other good sources of omega-3 like oysters. Unfortunately, a lot of shellfish now is contaminated with microplastics, and shellfish are higher in cadmium. We have to eat something, and so we just have to be aware. When I have clients that are eating a lot of shellfish, I'll always check their cadmium levels. If I have clients that are even eating a lot of wild salmon, I'll check their mercury levels. Sadly, I've seen moderately elevated mercury in people who are eating wild salmon. So one of the things I like about the roe. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, sardines I think are one of the lowest.
What is one of the lowest? Sardines?
Sardines have huge omega-3, way more than wild salmon, I think, and are a lower mercury fish.
Yeah, they're smaller. So the smaller the fish, the better in terms of mercury. And people can find all this information online in the mercury content. But tuna, for instance, is something I don't recommend anyone eat ever. It's so high in mercury now. It's really just a sad story. It's delicious, but it's really putting stress on the body in terms of the glutathione system to detoxify all the mercury found in tuna and some of these bigger fish. But sardines are a good option. Wild salmon is not a bad option, but my clients that eat wild salmon 2 to 3 times a week, often I find moderate levels of mercury in them. And it's like, well, that's one of the reasons I like the salmon roe, is that the dose is so much smaller. And you're eating 2 tablespoons of salmon roe, and you're getting the amount of DHA that's in like a pound of salmon, or 3/4 of a pound of salmon in just 2 tablespoons. So that's one of the things I like about the salmon roe versus the salmon itself. So
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I love tuna, so I try to minimize my intake of it and go for the lower mercury kind. There's some canned tuna that you can get that tells you it's been tested for mercury levels, but it's such a shame because I love tuna so much. I could eat it every day.
yeah, I mean, I think that if you're eating a lot of tuna, even if it's a tuna that says it's low mercury, I would test your mercury levels just to be sure, because mercury, ethyl mercury, organic mercury is pretty hard for our bodies to process.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Hey guys, just taking a really quick break to talk about the 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. If you're interested in doing a ketogenic diet for yourself, it's a great place to start. I teach you everything about how to follow a keto diet to get yourself into nutritional ketosis, and it includes 28 days of meal plans. It comes with weekly shopping lists, how to interpret results, how to test yourself, a complete guide to getting started on keto. If you've been keto for a while and you're just not getting the results that you want to in terms of your health or fat loss, or you are brand new to keto, the 28-day challenge is a great option because it also comes with my free coaching and support in our members Facebook group, and you can post any questions that you have about the meal plans, about keto, and I am there supporting you. We have an amazing community in our group because everybody in there is so excited about following keto, about having found something that really works well for them. And everyone in there is just so kind, caring, generous, and supportive. And it's a really fun place to be and hang out. So if you'd like more info on it, you can find it at ketogenicgirl.com. And it's the 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. And now back to our interview. So what does your keto diet look like now? And what are some things that you've learned from when you started to now that has kind of maybe shifted your approach?
For about the last months, I've been what I would call nose to tail carnivore. So I haven't eaten any plants in the last 8 months. And, we didn't have time to get into all of it, but, I don't think there's any need for fiber or any of these other polyphenols in plants. But yeah, I haven't eaten any plants for the last 8 months, and I feel really good. And I'm a physician and a functional medicine doc, so I'm pretty obsessive about my own blood work. I've probably done 300 lab tests on myself specifically, and over that amount of time. And, my inflammatory markers are extremely low. My CRP is undetectable and my kidney function is totally normal. But the last 8 months have been strictly Tail Carnivore. And through the time, I've just evolved with how I do it in terms of protein to fat macros, and a little more liver now than I used to eat, different forms of liver now. And, in the beginning, I was taking some supplements. And as I've learned more, I've let go of all my supplements. I definitely eat bone meal, which is animal bones, but I don't take any formal supplements. Like I mentioned earlier, I am concerned about things like titanium dioxide and silicone dioxide in supplements. And so I avoid all the supplements now. So generally on a day, I'm trying to get the most nutrient-rich animal foods sourced in the most sustainable and ethical way that I can. So I'm eating grass-fed organic muscle meat. The amount of muscle meat I eat in a day varies between a pound and 2.5 pounds of muscle meat. And I have more or less fat with that. I get grass-fed tallow or animal fat that I kind of combine with that. And I'm going to eat a decent amount of liver every day, maybe 3 ounces of liver a day now. And I'm eating salmon roe every day, and I'm occasionally eating raw oysters. I eat egg yolks every day. I don't do egg whites. I found that I react to those immunologically. I don't want to eat them raw. I eat most of my egg yolks raw because it's faster and I really like the way they taste. I found some really good local organic pastured duck egg yolks, which are just incredible. So I eat some duck egg yolks every day. And sometimes I usually add in some source of connective tissue into my diet, whether it's a collagen powder or actual tendons or a collagenous meat to try and get a little more of that glycine that I was talking about. And then I'm trying to source brain. I haven't been able to source it yet, but I do eat bone marrow from time to time when it's available. So that's the majority of my diet. And I think people may hear that and say, oh my God, like how can you do that every day? It doesn't get boring. And I think most people are surprised when they do a carnivore diet that it doesn't get boring, that animal foods are very palatable, they're very nutrient rich, and I don't really miss the plants at this point, and I don't really have any plans to go back and include them. And at this point, I'll also add that since doing this, I've been able to completely resolve my eczema in addition to the laboratory markers, which look really good. So the first time in probably the last 15 or 20 years of my life that the eczema is completely resolved is what I'm doing now without any supplements and trying to eat these higher quality animal foods. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the better and better you feel, like the more you just want to add in all these other things, like more liver, more this, more that. One thing I'd love to ask you about is I had a biochemist on the show and been studying biochemistry, so I love to geek out with her on that. But she's done some carnivore experimentation, does a lot of carnivore herself too. And we were talking about raw meat. And one thing I notice is like a lot of carnivore groups that I'm in and I observe, people start to eat and gravitate more and more towards raw meat. And also we were talking about how there's this like heightened satiety as well, or satiety when people eat raw meat. And her theory was that there's more nutrients available in meat that's less cooked. And that's why there is this higher satiety. And I wanted to ask you, one of the things I was pondering while we were traveling the last few weeks is, I wonder, could nutrient density and higher nutrient density in the foods you're eating have an impact on our hunger and satiety hormones? And what your thoughts were on that.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think much of satiety is nutrient sensing, whether it's macronutrient sensing or micronutrient sensing. I think a lot of what messes people up with weight loss and with satiety and with dietary efforts is they're not getting enough of protein specifically in terms of a macronutrient, and they're not getting enough of the micronutrients. I mean, yeah, I think micronutrient density is clearly tied to satiety, and the protein that people get is also probably tied to satiety as well. And then conversely, I think there are a lot of foods that can sabotage satiety, like fructose. There are lots of there's lots of research to suggest that fructose in the brain may affect signaling mechanisms around leptin and ghrelin, and our satiety. That fructose can be a sabotage to that. So here we looped back to fruit. I just wanted to get in my dig against fruit because. So yeah, I think it's totally true. And then if you're thinking about raw meat, yeah, sure. I eat most of my meat pretty darn rare. I don't really see a problem with searing the outside of your meat just to get rid of any bacteria that might be on the outside of your meat. I mean, I'm a physician, like I can't tell people to eat raw meat. I mean, if they're completely convinced that there's no bacteria on the raw meat, sure, it's not a bad thing. I mean, people have been eating beef tartare for, a century without a whole lot of problems. But, ruminant muscle meat is pretty safely consumed in a raw state, but you don't know who's handled it. Is there going to be a little E. coli on it? Probably not a big deal at all. But I think most people will find that cooked meat is a little more palatable. And as long as they don't overcook the meat, I think they're going to get so many of the nutrients, it's not going to be a big deal. But if people want to try eating raw meat, then yeah, source it well, make sure it's clean, know whose hands have been on it. I eat a lot of raw eggs, so I've never had a problem with that. The issue with eggs is when the shell is, contaminated. But if you're just eating the yolk raw, the shell doesn't really touch the yolk and there's no real contamination there. So yeah, I think you could eat raw meat if you wanted to. I eat my liver raw, and the liver that I eat now is frozen. So the freezing process will essentially kill anything that could be bad in it. So it's frozen for a week or something. And it's pretty safe to eat raw. I've never had any problems with raw liver. We know that the deep freeze or the long freeze is going to get rid of most problems. So if people are eating meat that's been frozen, it's probably safer. Just be a little careful with it, but I don't think there's any problem with that.
I haven't tried the raw beef yet. I did try raw reindeer actually in Helsinki. I was there speaking at the biohacking conference where actually Ben Greenfield was the headliner there. And I first heard of you when you were on his podcast.
Yeah,
it's like
awesome.
Full circle here. But have you convinced him to go carnivore?
I think that after our conversation, we hung out together. So I was fortunate to get to spend like a whole weekend hanging out with Ben, doing all sorts of fun dude stuff. I think he's interested in full carnivore. He said he was going to do a full carnivore experiment. I haven't heard back from him. I'm going to see him in a couple of weeks at Paleo FX, so I'll have to check in and see. But I think that, Ben has experimented with permutations of a carnivore diet in the past. He's interested. And I think that since I kind of talked to him about nose and tail, my impression, at least speaking to him and what he said on the podcast, was that he was more open to the idea of it. So we'll see. I'll see if I can get him to do a full trial.
Yeah. So back on the raw, I read that people can do rare steak because when you sear the outside, then bacteria can't get past those like outer layers. So you can safely eat, the meat that way. But then you did say something about like if I were to do raw beef, I think I would have it at a restaurant. And in Prague, it's everywhere. There's tartare at like almost every single restaurant. And you know that they're following like food safe guidelines and that kind of thing. Like I don't think I could just go to the store yet and like buy ground beef and eat it. There's just something about it. I just have to cook it if it was, prepared myself. But I do love raw sashimi and sushi. And I know you were saying something about there being a little bit more concerns with that, with the raw fish and parasites than raw beef.
Yeah. I mean, it is illegal, at least in the United States, to sell raw salmon that has not been frozen as sashimi in a sushi restaurant because the majority of Pacific salmon harbor a tapeworm called Diphyllobothrum latum,
Yummy.
which can cause a B12 deficiency. Yeah. So you don't want to eat raw salmon. Like, I've always been tempted and thought, I live in Seattle right now. I'm moving to San Diego, but I want to go out with a friend and fish and just, pull a salmon out of the ocean and just eat some sashimi right there. That's a horrible idea because most of these salmon have a tapeworm. And so you cannot buy sashimi salmon in a restaurant that is not frozen prior. And, some of the sushi chefs are good enough, maybe in Japan or something, they do this, they do fresh and they can see the tapeworm and they'll cut it out. But yeah, eating raw fish is a bad idea if the fish hasn't been frozen first. But the freezing process usually kills the kills the tapeworm, and it's not a problem.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a little bit of a scary thing.
Whenever I buy it, it's always like it's always frozen. Like if it's at a health food store or it's at a restaurant. Do the farmed salmon, just out of curiosity, do farm salmon also have it?
I mean, I don't know. I think that the farm salmon are probably going to have less of an incidence of the tapeworm because they're kept in a tank, but the farm salmon are going to have, essentially so many PCBs and other issues. I don't think I'd want to eat farmed salmon. And that's the other thing for people to know, is that the majority of salmon sashimi that you get at restaurants is farmed. And if you really want to ruin your night at a sushi restaurant, ask them how much of the fish is wild.
I've actually
unless it's a really good salmon.
I've actually found one place here in Prague that does wild salmon only sashimi, which is great. But
it's rare.
Yeah, it's really, speaking of rare, it's really rare.
Yeah.
Now, my last question, I've taken a lot of your time today, but I wanted to ask you about the insulinogenic effect of certain amino acids, especially leucine. And I know that it is talked about that certain amino acids like leucine can have a higher insulinogenic effect, but I'm curious on your opinion if that effect is tempered by having a lower insulin to glucagon ratio. If you're on a low carb diet or a zero carb diet, you have this totally different relationship in your body with insulin to glucagon. So I'm curious if you think or have seen any studies on that, or if those amino acids are maybe less insulinogenic, or...
Yes, so you're right. My impression actually is that I've had some conversations with Ben Beekman about this, because there was some concern. People were concerned that a high leucine diet, like a carnivore diet, would spike mTOR. And so I've had a lot of great conversations with Ben Beekman. I'll give him a hat tip, who's a researcher at Brigham Young University, who does a lot with insulin, and gave a great talk at, I believe it was Low Carb Denver a few years ago, about the insulin glucagon ratio and protein. And what we discovered, or what he and I talked about, was the fact that when you're in a ketogenic state, when your insulin to glucagon ratio is lower, your body reacts to protein very differently than when you are in a mixed carbohydrate diet state and your insulin to glucagon ratio is higher. So there are essentially two ways that your body can react to protein. It can cause a spike in insulin if you're eating it with carbohydrates, or if you're not in a ketogenic state, if you're not quote unquote fat adapted. Or if you eat protein when you are in ketosis, or when you are fat adapted, when your insulin glucagon ratio is much lower, it will not cause a spike in insulin. It will not change the insulin glucagon ratio. And in the latter situation, it really could not do that from a survival perspective, because if you ate protein and your body spiked the insulin when you were in ketosis, the rising insulin would shut off beta oxidation by inhibiting fatty acid lipase. Your ketones would quickly go to zero, and the insulin would shunt all of the glucose in your blood into the muscles, and you would not have anything for your brain to run on. So it's a pretty dangerous, that doesn't work that way. Your body protects serum levels of ketones and serum levels of glucose when you eat protein and you're in ketosis. So concerns that leucine or other amino acids will spike insulin are unfounded when you look at the science. It doesn't do that. There is evidence that eating a lot of protein may create some gluconeogenesis and may raise the glucose level in the blood a little bit, but I don't think it's that much of a concern for people on ketogenic diets. I feel like there's too much of a fixation on the ketone levels at the absence or at the exclusion of micronutrients that are associated with protein. So that's important to note. The other piece of this equation is that when we're talking about mTOR, so mammalian target or rapamycin, people would argue that high amounts of protein, or specifically leucine, which is a very anabolic amino acid, may trigger mTOR. And this is true, but if you look at the relative contributions to the triggering of mTOR of leucine and insulin, leucine triggers mTOR very transiently, only for 30 or 40 minutes in the studies that I've seen, while insulin triggers mTOR for 3 to 4 hours and has a much more robust triggering effect of insulin through different molecular mechanisms at the cellular level. So what we are seeing here is that if we are concerned about mTOR from a longevity perspective, and we are trying to minimize mTOR at least phasic during phasic periods. If we're trying to do cyclic mTOR, lowering, either through fasting or other, modalities, being worried about carbohydrates and being worried about insulin signaling is going to be a much greater effect on getting insulin to be lower and getting mTOR to be lower than worrying about protein. Protein is only going to stimulate mTOR for a short amount of time. But if you are eating carbohydrates or your insulin is high, you're going to be stimulating mTOR all the time. And no one talks about this. I would argue that a bigger contribution to constitutive mTOR activation is carbohydrates and levels of insulin that are high. So people shouldn't be worried about protein activating mTOR. They should be worried about bagels activating mTOR. And with regard to the insulin and the protein, it's just not a concern on a ketogenic state. But yeah, if you're eating carbohydrates and you're doing mostly glycolysis and you're not fat adapted, eating protein will spike your insulin. Whether or not that's always a bad thing is a question, but yes. Protein is more insulinogenic in a mixed state.
Right, but then you also have this fail-safe mechanism that the alpha cells release glucagon when you only consume a high protein meal with zero carb. So maybe that, is also a buffer countervailing force to that insulin being released to the amino acids.
Well, yeah, that's kind of what we were talking about, right? That insulin glucagon ratio is really the ultimate arbiter of which way your body swings, and that doesn't shift when you eat a bunch of protein in a ketogenic state.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Paul. I feel like I could pick your brain for hours and hours, and you've been so generous with your time. We'll have to have you back on for a part 2 sometime in the future, because I know people will be wanting to hear more of what you're into. And where can people find you and follow you in your work and research? And what are your sort of most active feeds?
So like I mentioned, I'm a functional medicine doc. I see clients privately who are interested in ketogenic or carnivore diets or any type of diet, and sort of help them work through their health issues if they have autoimmunity or psychiatric issues. People can send me an email if they'd like to work with me. It's paulsaladinomd@gmail.com. I have a website, which is paulsaladinomd.com, where people can see listings of the things I'm working on, my podcasts that I'm doing personally on my YouTube channel, and they can see a list of other podcasts that I've been on if they want to hear more of me or not. I'm on Instagram at paulsaladinomd. I'm on Twitter at mdsaladino. I'm on Facebook at Paul Saladino MD, and I have a Patreon under Paul Saladino MD. And I have a YouTube channel, which is Paul Saladino MD, on which I make a lot of videos about carnivore and nutrition and functional medicine. And I've started my own podcast, which is going to be out soon. It's called Fundamental Health, and that's coming out on iTunes and Stitcher, and it's on YouTube right now. So people can go to my YouTube channel and see some of the interviews that I've done with other people on there. So that's what I've got. I've got a lot going on.
Awesome. I love it. I love hearing about new keto podcasts, especially when they're, from MDs, because, there's just not really a ton of them out there. So I'm really looking forward to hearing it. And I love your videos on YouTube. So be sure to go check those out if you haven't yet. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Paul. I really appreciate the generosity of your time and all your insight that you shared with us today. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really had fun.
All right, guys, thank you so much for being here today and tuning in. I would like to invite you to check out the 20-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. A lot of the things that we talked about on today's episode, I find are really solved by doing a ketogenic meal plan like the one that I designed, the 20-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. And a lot of that comes down to having someone already calculate everything for you, having the macros all dialed in for you, having this meal plan with all the portions already outlined for you. It really helps address a lot of the portion control issues, and having everything calculated already really helps with preparation and doing batch prep. A lot of people on the challenge will pick out a day, say on Saturday or Sunday, and they'll meal prep ahead for the week, and they'll pick 2 or 3 days from the plan that they love, and they'll repeat it, such as day 5, which has the burger with my special keto burger sauce, and repeat that. And you can do that as many times as you like, and it really makes preparation and following keto and the meal plans a lot easier, and doing that batch prepping and meal prep on the weekend. And the meal plans also come with a shopping list. They come with a full guide to testing yourself for ketosis. And the best part is they include my support and coaching in our members Facebook group, which is an awesome community. I love being in there, and it really helps so much having other people doing this program with you and alongside, and people who've done it already and successfully reached their goals there to inspire you and to support you. And having that community built in is so important. Our success rates go way up when we're doing any kind of diet or lifestyle change when we have a buddy. And I'm here to be your buddy, to be your guide and help you with your journey, because you can post any questions that you have about keto, about the meal plans, about low carb, and I am there to answer your questions and to support you as you go. And I just think it makes such a big difference to have a coach and a support group and a supportive community around you. So check out the 20-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. Just a word of caution, there is another 20-day keto challenge that's being sold. It is not mine. I only sell my program from ketogenicgirl.com. So if you see a link to that, it's a copycat version that has kind of popped up in the last year. It also has a similar name, 20-day Ketogenic Challenge. But if you are looking for my program, which comes with my support and coaching, you can only get it from ketogenicgirl.com, and make sure that you are purchasing the one from me, because I have some people who have purchased this other program thinking that it's my program, and the coaching and support is not included because it's not the program that I formulated and that has had so much success. If you want to read and check out some of the success stories, you can go to ketogenicgirl.com and click on testimonials and reviews or success stories, and you can read some of the dozens and dozens of success stories of people who have done the challenge. And if you join the program, you'll get to interact with so many of those people in the group who've had real success and are there to share tips and tricks for making all of this so much easier and so much fun. So check out the 20-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge at ketogenicgirl.com. And until the next episode, I hope you have a fat-fueled rest of your day. A few disclaimers. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to use this podcast as medical advice, as I am not a qualified healthcare provider. The information presented on this podcast is for educational purposes only. Ketogenic Girl is not qualified to provide medical advice. Consult your own physician for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to this podcast. Prior to beginning a ketogenic diet, you should undergo a full health screening with your physician to confirm that a keto diet is suitable for you and to rule out any conditions or contraindications that may pose risk or that are incompatible with the ketogenic diet. A keto diet may or may not be appropriate for you if you have any kind of health condition, whether known to you or unknown, so you must consult your physician to find this out. Anyone under the age of 18 should consult with their physician and their parents or legal guardian.